much because I'm in a room that is virtually empty here, you know, and yeah, so I guess we'll have to start this somehow. Let me just switch on this backup thing here. It's very weird here that the recording sometimes for Google Meet takes a while. I haven't really quite figured out why this is the case here. But anyways, so sorry I'm late. You know, there's this conference. I'm just coming from a workshop, a pre-conference workshop, and so a pre-conference workshop, and I thought it was nice. Today was the last day, but unfortunately, we finalized this thing in good time here. I think we were wrapping up somewhere around 12:20, 12:30, somewhere there. The remarks from the CEO for the Information and Communication Technology Association of Zambia were finalized right before lunch here, and so we're leaving Chongwe in good time, but you know, there's an event that is starting tomorrow, you know. There's an event that is starting tomorrow, and again, I'm playing an active role in what's happening tomorrow, but not that it matters anyways. And so I'm just coming from the meeting. In fact, I left the meeting because the person who was facilitating it is using a freemium version of Zoom, right? A free tier subscription of Zoom here, and so the meeting cut, and I decided I was just going to leave and start class here. I don't think we have the luxury of missing classes here, you know. But anyways, so on with it. We're going to continue our discussion of research design, if you remember. And you know, when we met last time on Tuesday, I think it was yesterday in the morning, I was geared for us to start looking at the other illustration techniques, but I decided we were going to look at some example. I mean, it was one of those impromptu kind of interactions. I didn't plan for us to go through the JCTR exam, but I'm glad we did, because it kind of opened you up somehow. You know, I was hinting at the fact that the Jesuit Center for Theoretical, you know, Reflection uses structured interviews. We haven't really, you know, discussed interviews at length, but they use structured interviews, and this will make sense, right? They're more or less like questionnaires, but they're interviews, right? So you have a fixed set of questions. Suffice to say that in most instances, especially as it relates to students, what students will tend to do is they will use so-called semi-structured interview guides, ideally, right? So there was mention of that. Now, what I would like us to do today is I would like us to transition and hopefully talk about maybe two of the remaining data collection techniques, right? Measurement instruments, we introduce them as, so that we know exactly how to go about collecting data in the event that you're planning to use something else other than a questionnaire. All right. So we're going to start our discussion of interviews here. Now, formal definition. You know, when I was putting together this presentation slide deck, I sat there and I'm like, I think what I need to do is dumb down these slides a little. So I've made extensive changes to the slides, or to this slide deck. I decided to include some sort of a formal definition of what an interview is. So an interview is a purposeful conversation between a researcher and a participant. Now, it's a conversation, right? It's purposeful, you know. and hopefully this kind of definition makes sense, right? You have heard such a thing as, oh, I'm going to attend an interview or something. What that means is you're going to have a conversation, right? And typically that conversation will be between you, a potential employee, and your potential employers, right? So it's a purposeful conversation. Typically, it's done in a format where, you know, the interviewee will be sitting across a table from the interviewers, okay? So it's a purposeful conversation between, within the context of research, or at least research design. It's a purposeful conversation between a researcher and a study participant. I want to qualify this, a study participant. And really, it turns out that it's one of those primary instruments, right, for strategies like case studies. We are regurgitating the things that we discussed not too long ago. During our discussion of strategies, we kept on referring to, for each strategy, right, we had this. We were referring to potential tools, right, that can be utilized for that sort of strategy. I don't know if you remember this. I don't know where the strategies are here, but at some point, there we go, right? We say that, you know, for case study, for instance, you typically use interviews, right? If you remember, for ethnography, you typically leverage observations, or participant observations, or perhaps interviews, for instance, right? I hope you are paying attention here. It's like we're doing a reverse now, right? We're looking at interviews, and we're saying that interviews are the primary, right? The primary measurement instrument when you are leveraging a case study strategy, or when you're leveraging ethnography. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot use, you know, interviews if you're conducting an experiment. You can, okay? But we're saying that for the most part, it's tied to those two strategies. Hopefully, you're taking note, or you're taking notes, right? Both taking note and taking notes explicitly, that is. But also, we see here that it typically is associated with qualitative studies, if you will, right? Or in instances where you're leveraging mixed methods studies, you're conducting a mixed method study, you'd be looking at the qualitative phase. So in other words, what we are saying is that in the case where you're leveraging the convergent mixed method design, for instance, where you're conducting both, you know, the quantitative and qualitative studies at the same time, if you look at the time frame, what we are saying is that the qualitative part would typically make use of interviews, right? Anyways, and it turns out really that the interaction, right, the collection of data is done with individual participants. Yeah, so this notion that when you identify the people that you're going to be interviewing, what you do is you interact with them as individuals. In other words, if I was wanting to conduct an interview with one of you people, there are 53 of you currently attending class, and I'm conducting a study, right, that requires that I collect data from you, and I want to conduct an interview. What I would do is I would sample from amongst you, maybe 10 of you. So 10 of you would be participants, and I would interact with you separately, with the 10 selected participants separately. That's an important point to stress, right? Anyway, so there's that. And really, when we start looking at the characteristics of a so-called use here, we see that they're flexible, right? Flexible from the perspective of the type of data that you're collecting. In other words, you're not just collecting responses associated with these fixed questions. On a scale of, how often do you use the AI tutoring service? How often have you used the AI tutoring service this semester? For a questionnaire, right? You cannot elicit, you know, information outside the bounds of these fixed questions, right? If I was conducting an interview, maybe one of the things I would start with is I would ask you, do you use the AI tutoring service? And maybe your response would be yes, right? Okay. So roughly how often do you use it often is what I would ask, right? And maybe you'd say, I do, kind of, right? And then I'll be like, but how often? Let's say per week. On average, per week, how often do you use it? Maybe you say maybe once or something. And it'll be like, oh, okay, do you use this AI tutoring service for all your courses, or is that for specific courses? You notice here that there's a bit of flexibility in terms of the type of data that we are collecting, right? Beyond just asking, right? Using these fixed options, tell me, right, how often you've used the tutoring system. So what we're saying here is there's a bit of flexibility, is it? And really, because of this flexibility, it turns out that the I do apologize. I'm checking my computer here. I'm about to reshare my screen. It appears you're not able to hear me or something. Just give me a minute or so. Sorry for Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Can get you.
Thank you so much. I don't know what happened here. I've had my computer on for the last, I don't know if it's 2 weeks here or something, and I think it needs a reboot. But we're talking about some of the key characteristics associated with interviews, right? And we see that they're flexible. So, they'll allow you to kind of like get information, a lot more information than what you would otherwise gather or collect when you're using a questionnaire, for instance. Okay? But we see here that because of their flexibility, the data that you collect is going to be richer, right? You're in a position where you can get more in-depth qualitative data, ideally. That's a key thing here. And so over and beyond just the numeric attributes that you're collecting using a questionnaire, you have this opportunity to collect richer data, ideally. It's time sensitive, right? It's an important point here because it turns out that this is one of the disadvantages, right, of leveraging interviews as measurement instruments. So this notion that when you conduct interviews, right, there's a lot you have got to do before you get to the stage where you collect data. With a questionnaire, right, you launch a questionnaire today using Google Forms, and extracting that information is as easy as just going to your Google Forms, and then you say export data or something. It's as easy as this, by the way. You go to your questionnaire. In this particular case, I'm just going to attempt to see if I can get to the COVID-19 questionnaire that I was using as an example, because at least it has it has responses, right? I'll get to the questionnaire, the COVID-19 questionnaire, and I'll just choose forms here so that I filter what I'm looking for. And then if I wanted to get the responses, imagine you've launched a questionnaire. This is you've launched a questionnaire. Once you're happy with the number of responses, this 38 responses, what you do to extract these is you just export to Google Sheet, right? And you have access to the information right there and then. This is it. From here, you can do your analysis, right? You pivot the data, for instance, you do your inferential statistics to augment your descriptive statistics, right? However, when you're leveraging interviews, you have got to, it takes time for you to conduct interviews. Remember, I'm giving an example of 10 participants, is it? There's 10 of you, 10 students. And let's say each interview is going to take 30 minutes, right? Interview duration, 30 minutes. I have got to liaise with each and every one of the 10 students to find out when are the 10 students available to come and participate in the interview. It may be the case that they're not available on the same day, right? So in fact, typically when you're conducting interviews, like 10 interviews, it's likely that it will take maybe 2 or 3 weeks or something. 2 weeks maybe, right? Because you have to schedule, you have to check your calendar to see when you're available and when the interviewee is available and stuff. But beyond this, right, when you collect your data, remember, well, I haven't gotten to that stage, but typically you would record the interviews, is it? Or you're taking notes in the interview session, but also recording the interview session. For you to analyze the recorded, the audio recording of the interview, you would have to transcribe it. So in other words, you're converting the audio into text because what you analyze is the text, right? For you to make sense out of what is being discussed. And what you're thinking, well, I'm just going to play back the recording and then take down notes. Usually, you systematically take a note of the key things that were discussed in the interviews from all the participants. So typically, you conduct what's called a thematic analysis, and more in the next lecture series here. It turns out that takes time, right? And then you analyze. So what we're saying is that interviews are time insensitive, right? They eat up a considerable amount of time. Now, it turns out that there are different ways in which you can interact with these interviewees. There are different strategies that you can leverage, right? So in essence, there are 3 main types of interviews. You have what are called structured interviews, semi-structured interviews, and unstructured interviews. Structured interviews can be viewed as being verbally administered questionnaires. So in other words, you create this rigid script that you stick to. You don't veer off the script. If I'm going to interview these 10 students using a structured interview, I will prepare a series of questions. What are your thoughts? Your thoughts on the AI system? How often do you use the AI system? Tell me about yourself, right? As in, seeing as you're a student or something. I am going to ask all of these 10 students these same questions, right? I'm taking note of their responses. Okay? So it's a verbally administered questionnaire in part because the questions and their order are fixed. I'm going to interact with all 10 of you in this order. First, I will ask you this question. And then I will transition and ask you this question. And then finally, I will ask you this question. For each and every 10 of these interviewees, same order, same questions. Right? And typically, when you're doing this, you find yourself generating some sort of quantitative data or something like that. However, we see with the semi-structured interviews, by the way, this is the most widely used type of interview, right? And I'm sure you've noticed in the papers you've been reading that most authors will say, we use the semi-structured interview guide as outlined in the appendices section or the annex section. So what you do is, as a researcher, you use an interview guide, right, that lists key themes and open-ended questions, right? This is an important thing here. There are key themes and open-ended questions. So beforehand, you know that you're going to ask a question related to tell me about yourself or something, right? But you're asking these questions in such a way that you can veer off course, right? So in here, maybe I'll tell me about yourself as it relates to the University of Zambia. And you tell me, I'm a second-year student. I'm like, oh, okay. What's your experience? What has your experience been like, or something like that, as it relates to studying, right? As it relates to studying, yeah. In essence, what I'm trying to hint at here is that you can veer off course, right? You can probe. You can probe. And the interesting thing about semi-structured interviews is in some instances, right? In some instances, the questions that you ask are dependent on the responses that you're getting. So in the case of the second question that I'm asking you, what are your thoughts on the AI system? Or tell me about yourself. You tell me you're in second year. Then I want to ask you different questions than if you tell me that you're in fourth year. You understand? It's not rigid. It's not strict, right? Typically, the course is going to be dictated by the responses coming in from the participants. Okay. So you can probe, you can reorder, and then you can, and this is a key one, you can explore new ideas based on the responses. So another example is, I'm asking you, how often do you use the AI system? If you tell me, I use the AI system maybe once a week, the type of questions I'm going to have to ask you, or I'm going to ask you, are going to be different from somebody who tells me, I use that piece of software almost every day. You understand? So the key thing here is that you can probe, you can reorder the questions, and you can explore new ideas. It's semi-structured, right? Your guide will have probing questions, right? But the responses from the participants are going to dictate the course of direction you're going to take. Anyhow. And then you have unstructured interviews, right? The opposite of structured interviews, right? You typically would start your unstructured interviews with a single broad topic, right? It's like just the very first question is enough. And then the response you give me are going to dictate the flow, right, of the conversation we're going to have. And typically, the flow of the conversation is going to be guided by the participants, which is why probing is important. You don't ask yes or no questions. Otherwise, you have a situation where somebody's just giving you short answers and you won't really be able to get or gather in-depth data. Okay, this makes sense. So 3 main types of interviews: structured interviews, semi-structured interviews, and unstructured interviews. Now, the other important thing to note here is that, when you have a discussion about interviews, there's always this misrepresentation, especially from students that are doing research for the first time, that what you're actually doing is you're interacting with these participants in a physical space. That's not the case, right? It turns out that there's different sort of strategies that you can employ insofar as interviews are concerned. The obvious one, obviously, is what we call face-to-face interviews. So you have a situation where both the interviewer and the interviewee are co-located. They're in the same space. So in your case, what I would be doing is I would tell you, come to room 515, right? Come to room 515, and then we're going to have a conversation in room 515 or something like that. Right? So it's a face-to-face interview. But it turns out that you can also conduct interviews via the telephone, right? So I could decide to say, you know what I'm going to do, because it's not convenient for me to do this, to do this in a space where we're both co-located. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to plan to call you, right? So I'll use my telephone, give you a call, and then we'll have an interaction over a prolonged period of time, maybe for 30 minutes or something. Do you understand this? It turns out that in this day and age, right, with the advent of email, now that everybody uses email, you can actually conduct an interview using email, right? An email interview. So you have a back and forth here. The interviewer has a back and forth with the interviewee. And, I always like using this as an example. I'm going to showcase something here to you. I'm going to showcase something to you. Not too long ago, I think it's probably been a year or so or something. I had somebody contact me, right? To let me just showcase this. I remember, there we go, right? Email interview. In fact, this is quite nice, is it? The subject says it all, right? Email interview, right? So it's possible for you to conduct interviews via email. And this day and age, you can also use WhatsApp, right? So instant messaging, right? I worked with some students in 2022, I think it was, who conducted interviews with students via WhatsApp. In addition, you can actually conduct an interview, right, using the platform that we are using to interact, right, when we're having class, virtual class. So you can use video conferencing software like Google Meet or Zoom. Skype is dead now, but the Big Blue Button, for instance, a whole range of tools that you can leverage. Now, what you begin to notice here is that there are certain characteristics associated with these different ways of conducting interviews, right? Like, for instance, you can look at them from the perspective of the interaction time, is it? In some instances, you are interacting with the interviewer and the interviewee are interacting synchronously, right, at the same time. So if it's a face-to-face interview, I ask you a question, you answer. However, if you're using email, it may take a day, maybe 2 days before I get back a response, right? We can also look at it from the perspective of location, is it? With face-to-face interviews, you're co-located, right? Both the interviewee and the interviewer are in the same space, ideally, right? So there are all these different things to look at. Now, the choice of which one to use is dependent on you. It's dependent on resources. It's costly for you to conduct face-to-face interviews, especially when the people you're interviewing are located in different areas, right? Not just different areas, the instances where you have got to follow the people you're going to interview. Last year, I worked with students who had to interview Lusaka City Council and RDA. For them to get to a stage where they were interviewing engineers from RDA, what they had to do was they had to go to RDA, I think, on 3 separate occasions. So you go there and then they tell you, write a formal letter. You go there and they tell you, these are the people you're going to interact with, and then you go there to conduct the interview. Now, in all those different instances, right? RDA is located where? In Ridgeway, right? I don't know if you know where RDA is, somewhere off Government Road or something like that. It's not cheap to get there. You'd have to get on a Yang or something. So in fact, what I was doing with these students is I was kind of like footing the bill on their behalf. Not that I should have been doing this because they get project allowance, right? So if you notice here, RDA to UNZA here, give you an idea of how much money you'd have to foot here, right? You can't get on a bus because maybe RDA tells you must come at this time. So you say, well, I'm just going to get on a Yang or something, 9 kilometers, and you realize that it's quite costly here. Well, not very costly, but you'd need a budget, right? And I think maybe I can pull out something here to it's important sometimes to give you an idea, Yango plus RDA or something like that. I don't know if I'll be able to find information I'm looking for about Yango and RDA. I would ask them to, every time they go there, I'll just ask them, I remember asking them, drop a budget so that we plan ahead of time or something, right? I'm going to say from Harris or something, Shikapanda or something like that. I don't know, Yango, no. How about not David actually? Like, yeah, David. Maybe not. How about two? I thought it was there. Yep. So, well, this was a cyber tech conference, but we'll do something like this, right? Where they send me details of Yango fees and stuff. But anyways, so there's that, right? Just bear in mind that there are all these different things. But also, away from money, it turns out that some forms of interaction are better than others. Like for instance, it turns out that when you have human interaction, when you have two people interacting, if you're interacting with somebody in a manner where you're doing this face to face, it's much more advantageous because there are certain things that you won't be able to pick up if you use the phone, for instance, or email, like facial expressions, right? Or gestures. If you notice when I'm teaching, right? No, I haven't really watched myself teach here, but I'll probably do other things that will help drive the point home, as the white man says, right? So that it's hopefully a lot easier for you to understand. So if you're interviewing somebody, maybe the facial expression, if somebody squints, will give you an idea that, oh, maybe they're a bit apprehensive about, whatever it is you're talking about or something. Or they have a negative perception about what you're talking about, and that will help you change direction. So you've got to take into account all these different things here. And the fact that in some instances, the responses that you get back, may come your way much later, right? Like if you're using email, there's no guarantee that if somebody sends me an email as part of an interview, then I'll respond on that particular day. Maybe it'll take me a day or two or something like that. Anyways, but the other things like where exactly are you going to conduct these interviews from, right? These interviews. Imagine a situation where you want to interview students. Where are you going to interview them from? Is it the Gomalex? Are you going to have to reserve a room on campus or something? So all those things to think about here. But just to mention here that as you are thinking about using an interview as a guide, you must probably take into account the fact that it's important that you use a mix of closed and open-ended questions, but also to remember that your interviews are really good at getting an overall understanding of the people you're interacting with here, right? You want to be open-minded. You remember the goal here is to probe, right? You're probing. Don't, when you're interacting with an interviewee, don't go in there with assumptions, right? Keep an open mind, in other words. It's important that you prompt. Usually, when you're interacting with some people, it's like pulling teeth, is it? It'll be difficult for you to get responses from them. So make sure that you deliberately ask probing questions. You don't just ask, how often do you use an AI system, right? You need to figure out smarter ways of probing, so that you get rich data from the interviewee in this particular case. Again, in terms of your preparation, it's important to prepare. You want to ensure that you prepare your guide beforehand with specific questions. But in addition to that, you always want to pilot it, right? Remember our definition of the pilot. You test it out on maybe a colleague or something, right? So that you refine the instrument. Usually when you pilot, it gives you an opportunity to identify fundamental flaws, right? Gaps in the questions that are in your guide, okay? Also, it's important that as part of sampling, you identify appropriate individuals to interview. Remember, unlike questionnaires where you are working with a large user base, you typically be working with a significantly smaller group of individuals. So you want to make sure that you pick them wisely here. Also, always make sure that you record the interview. As much as you can take notes, right? You go there with your notebook and you're taking notes. It's advisable that you record the interview sessions. Back in the day, it used to be that you would need an audio recorder, a dictaphone or something, a dedicated hardware device that would allow you to record audio conversations. However, in 2025, you can actually use your mobile phone. And in fact, this is what we've done in most of the studies that we've conducted. It's always important to ensure that you follow all ethical issues that were discussed before you record anybody, you must ask for permission. So typically it's at the beginning, right? Hi, Lighton, would like to interview you about your 2034 course because we want to understand students' perceptions, right? On research in general, you know? But before we start, is it okay if we record this conversation? We assure you this conversation is not going to be shared with anybody else, so only the researchers will have access to it, and we are only going to use it to analyze data for the purposes of the research we are conducting, right? Ethics, so you ask for permission. It's important that you ask for permission. In addition, because you are dependent on hardware devices, you want to make sure that your equipment is functional. So if you're using a dictaphone, for instance, make sure it works. If you're using a mobile device, make sure it has ample space so that you don't have a situation where you're unable to record because you ran out of space, or you're unable to record because there was load shedding and your phone was not charged, right, to full capacity or something. I always tell students, at the very least, just make sure you have 2 mobile phones that you're using for recording, for instance. Anyways, is this making sense, by the way? Are you there? Can you hear me, you guys? Have I lost connection again? Hello?
We can get you, sir.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. Yeah, you want to make sure you do due diligence here. So make sure you similar to questionnaires. Thanks, Risha. You want to make sure that you conduct your preliminary work, right? Determine an appropriate interview technique. Are you going to use your phone? Are you going to conduct face-to-face interviews? Are you going to use a video conferencing software platform like Zoom or Google Meet, right? Or are you going to use email, for instance? There's a colleague who has an office on the same floor as me, Professor Musanka. I remember this one time he comes to my office and tells me, I need your help, Lighton, because I was conducting a telephone interview with teachers in Southern Province because of this project we are running, and I can't seem to find the recording on my phone, right? So anyways, so it was an Android phone and we were able to locate the recording itself. Okay, so telephone interviews, choose the two. Research your audience, obviously. Research any ethical issues and considerations. In some instances, it may be the case that you would need to get permission over and beyond getting ethical clearance approval from the Humanities and Social Sciences Research Ethics Committee. You may also need to maybe get permission from elsewhere, right? Maybe from that entity itself, Imagine a situation where you're interviewing kids, right? Grade 5 children or something. You know that you can't get consent from grade 5 kids, so you'd have to get permission from their parents, right? Yeah, consent, it would have to be granted by their guardians, their legal guardians. But anyways, in addition, especially if you're leveraging face-to-face interviews, you want to make sure that you schedule appointments. We are going to be conducting interviews, right? Let's see if I can find this here. We want to be conducting interviews here. Can you let us know when you are going to be available for these interviews or something like that? I don't know if I thought I would be able to find a sort of like a request to conduct an interview at some point. We were working on something with my dear colleague Enes, very dear friend of mine, and he was the one who was organizing these interviews, right? Look at this. Yeah, this was the time when we were organizing an interview at Medland with, these different entities or something like that. Yeah, look at this, right? So we were scheduling here. This was in 2023. I don't know. No, this was different anyway. But anyways, so it's different thing here altogether. Yeah, kind of interesting stuff here. You want to schedule your appointments with the interviewees, but also you want to make sure that you prepare your consent forms, because especially when before you collect this data, right? Somebody has got to consent, is it? You give them an information sheet, right? Similar to questionnaires, you give them an information sheet, you give them the informed consent form, they sign, right? And then you start the interview itself. Yeah. More importantly, you want to make sure that you prepare the interview guide beforehand, right? Anyways, it's important that you devise a formal interview plan here. Identify all the materials you're going to require. You're going to require a dictaphone. How many phones? Do you need a power bank? Especially right now, if you're conducting interviews in 2025 in Zambia in August, where there's load shedding or brownouts, maybe one of the pieces of equipment that you need is a power bank, right? In case you go to Lighton's office, you schedule an appointment, Lighton tells you come at 9, you go there and he tells you, well, I'm busy right now, I want you to come somewhere around 15, and there's no power, right? Power bank or something like that. Always pilot your interview guide here, right? You must make sure that this guide, in terms of the interview guide, it must be comprehensive. Typically, you always start this interview guide in such a way that there's a briefing where or an introduction, you introduce yourself and the project. You know, my name is Hope, and I'm conducting a study to do with EduRoam. You know, the project is being done as part of the LIS 2034 course. You know, we are hoping that we can talk to you about internet connectivity here at Ridgeway campus or something like that, right? We think that the potential outputs of this research are going to inform what sort of changes that Xamarin should make, right? So that internet connectivity, the service really is of high quality in essence, right? The internet connectivity. You know, before we start, could you please read through this information sheet and please sign this informed consent form? We have gotten ethical clearance from the Humanities, the University of Zambia Humanities and Social Sciences Research Ethics Committee. You've introduced yourself, right? And then once the interviewee is okay with that, then you get into the meat of everything, right? And then you debrief, right? So the body is what's going to contain these questions that I was showcasing here. Tell me about yourself, what are your thoughts on the AI system and stuff, right? Pretty straightforward stuff. Now, I thought I would kind of include an example here, right? You know, let's say our topic is to explore student experiences with the new AI tutoring system that the UNZA is setting up, right? So how I would conduct, this is my interview guide, the thing in red here. It will have an introduction. It's like in a Microsoft Word document, by the way, it's a script, right? An introduction, you know, thank you for meeting with me, blah, blah, blah. You know, and then I'm mentioning here, right? This interview is anticipated to take no more than 30 minutes. It's going to be confidential. You can stop me at any point in time, right? If you feel uncomfortable being a part of this interview, tell us to stop and we'll stop. Do I have permission to record your conversation? Now, you know, the part where I'm saying you can stop anytime, it turns out that some studies may be sensitive. I think about this for a second. The prep study, where you're talking about prep, if you're interviewing somebody, you tell them, if you feel uncomfortable talking about this, we can stop, right? I just have examples of opening questions. Not that we're saying that these questions are supposed to be structured exactly like this, no, right? They could be different, you know? I don't know what happened there. I was almost choking. Not sure what's happening here, but all right. So just giving you an example of like questions, right? By the way, this is a semi-structured interview, if you notice. We have probes there, is it? Yeah, pretty straightforward stuff. And then, you know, so I have a series of an opening question, which is typically demographic details, right? How often you use the system, whether you've used it before, you know, what year you are in and stuff. And then I have the actual key questions associated with my research question in this particular case. Yeah, more core questions. And then what you notice is that towards the end, I debrief, is it? I have like a closing kind of statement or question here, you know? And usually this is an opportunity for you to ask if the participant is okay with you reaching out to them in the event that you need to. Sometimes once you go through the transcript itself, the recording, you discover that there are interesting responses from this participant. So you may want to go back to them. You have got to get permission. Are you comfortable with us reaching out to you in case we need to make follow-ups on this? Say yes, and it's about, all right, fine, thank you. You know, so pretty straightforward stuff here, right? Now, here's the thing. I wanted to kind of remind you of something else that I showcased to you, like what do you call this? A manuscript, right, done by some student not too long ago. What you notice is that typically when you put together manuscript like for a dissertation and stuff, or even your report, towards the end here in the appendices section or the annex section, you include this information here. You see this? Okay, this is a questionnaire. You include the instrument that you use. This is a structured questionnaire, but here we go. Boom. Thank you very much, Mr. Sir. Semi-structured interview guide, right? Where this person has the name of the researcher, you know, research title, the time required. It's a lot though. Right? And then the actual questions here. Yeah. Semi-structured. Why? All of the people that were interviewed here were interacted with by following the questions as they appear here, right? In the same order. Why semi-structured? Well, because as the interview was taking place, if something interesting, if an interesting response was uttered by the interviewee, you can branch, or there's an opportunity for you to probe, right? As you're interacting with the interviewee. Hope this is making sense, ladies and gentlemen. You know, what we're going to do when we meet next on Saturday, thank you very much, 17 hours, because some of you go to church apparently, 16 hours, I don't know. We're going to start looking at observations. We're going to talk about observations, and then after observations, we're going to see if we can quickly talk about secondary data so that we set the stage for our preparation of how exactly we identify an appropriate number of, I want to say, participants from where we're going to collect data from, right? So how do we arrive at a sample size? What sort of sampling techniques are we going to leverage and stuff? I'm going to pause here, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry that there was a bit of connectivity issues at some point, but are there any questions about this? Today, literally today, I'm putting up that assignment where you're supposed to collect data now, because you are either using a questionnaire, and these are parameters here. You're only allowed to collect data using either a questionnaire or an interview guide, right? You're supposed to use interviews or questionnaires because we have little time left here. And I'm going to put this up. I'll just assume it's Thursday. The exercise, you're expected to collect data by the 4th, right? By the 4th, so that we prepare for you to do your final presentations in the week of the 8th. By the 4th, we'll have finished looking at data analysis, hopefully. Are there any questions? I'm going to put up the assignment A. Ladies and gentlemen, listen, thank you very much. See you when you see me. We have class on Saturday. I want to say tentatively 16 hours, probably 16 hours, but possibly 17 hours. Bye for now, I guess. Thanks.